Hello and welcome to our monthly Keep Data Private community event. You have myself, Daniela, hello, and you also have Marcel.
Hiya.
So we get together every month to have a conversation about a topic related to privacy, specifically data privacy, and throw around a few ideas of why something is a good idea or a bad idea. Marcel, do you want to introduce today's topic, or should I?
Feel free to introduce it.
So, in a nutshell, the UK government has asked Apple to disable the secure encryption, end-to-end encryption, that would allow users of Apple products to have all of the data encrypted in such a way that neither Apple nor any government can have access to it. Now, within the UK, at this point of recording, this feature is disabled. And that throws up so many questions that are interesting to go into and discuss, and that is what we are trying to do today. From a technical perspective, Marcel, do you want to give just a little bit more meat on the bones than what I can give?
So Apple has two forms of data encryption for their backing up your data into the Apple Cloud. One is the standard encryption, which gives Apple the key or owns the key, and they manage the key for you. That's the key that's used to encrypt the data, so that when you update your or you back up your data, it gets encrypted using that key, and it gets stored in the Apple service. They also have advanced encryption, which allows the user to be the owner of the key that's used to encrypt the data. So when you want to back up the data, you encrypt the data with that key, and it gets backed up on the Apple Cloud service. Now, the difference between the two is who owns the key, or at least specifically the private key, that allows you to decrypt that data. In the first instance, the standard encryption, Apple owns the key, which means they control who can view the data that's stored in the cloud, your data that's stored in the cloud. In the second instance, with the advanced encryption, you as the user are the one that owns the private key that is used to decrypt the data that is stored in the cloud. So that means that Apple, and anyone that Apple decides to give the key to, is able to view all the data that's stored in the cloud with the standard encryption. With the advanced encryption, only you are able to decide who can view the data and that is stored in the Apple Cloud. What's changed is that they've disabled the advanced encryption for United Kingdom users. And what's changed is it's only for new users. So if you try and back up your data to the cloud, and you're a new Apple user and you haven't previously enabled advanced encryption, then you will only be given the option to use the standard encryption. The advanced encryption will no longer be available to you, which means that any UK user or new user who decides to back up their data to the Apple iCloud now basically gives Apple the permission to decide who can view that data. All existing users that have already been using the advanced encryption, they will continue to be encrypted with that key that they own. Apple obviously cannot decrypt that data. They will be asked to disable advanced encryption and use the standard encryption, in other words, give up their rights to control who has access to the data going forward. That is apparently what will happen sometime in the future. But at the moment, existing UK users who are using advanced encryption will still have their data encrypted using their own private key. But any new users in the UK won't. So from a technical perspective, it's basically who controls the access to the data, who can decide who can decrypt the data that's stored in the Apple Cloud. Does that make sense?
It does. And whilst from a technical perspective it makes sense, it doesn't intuitively make sense on why that decision was taken by the UK government.
Well, the UK government wants to be able to access the data of what they call terrorists and criminals. So if you're a terrorist or criminal and use an Apple product in the UK, they want to be able to see what data you have stored and backed up into the Apple cloud. That's their argument. It's the usual. There's a minority few that they would like to be able to access, and the encryption is too hard for them to work around. They cannot access the data. They want to be able to access that data. So they're basically prepared to compromise everybody's security, everyone's privacy, for the sake of being able to access data that may be stored in the Apple cloud by criminals and terrorists or potential terrorists who are using Apple products. A and B are backing up their data into the Apple cloud.
True, and that I still understand, but there's nothing stopping anyone to buy an Apple product outside of the UK, set it all up, set up the backup, and then go back home to the UK where you live and use your Apple product there. So would that still be accessible by the UK government in that scenario, for example?
I don't know. I don't know. Other than using IP address as a basis of where you're setting it up. So if you're a UK based individual, then you set up your encryption that way, and you say I'm based in the UK. Then that's going to be the restriction. All of these things, as you say, you don't even have to go outside the country. You can use a VPN to pretend you're physically somewhere else to be able to bypass that restriction. But I think it's less about the technical details. As I said, if you're a criminal or a terrorist and you're using an Apple product and you're going to back up your data to the Apple cloud, are you really thinking this through? As to really where your data is? And the reality of it is that this is a question we all have to ask ourselves now. I think especially if you're a UK user, do you want to have your data in the Apple cloud where anybody can access it? Whether you're a terrorist or not, I think it's a question that every person should be asking themselves. Do you want to be the one that controls who has access to your data or not? Especially since previously you could rely on the fact that data was encrypted with a key that only you had access to, and you were the one that controlled who could access that data or not. So I don't think it's what's important is why, because the why is criminals and terrorists and child traffickers, but the reality is it's everyone that asks that question. And how much how much is the UK gaining by having that access versus how much they're losing by exposing their citizens to data breaches and data encryption. Was watching an interesting video on this topic by I can't remember the YouTube channel's name. Come back to me.
I will put the link to that video into the comments below so that anyone watching it can go and watch that video as well.
Thank you. But he was pointing out the fact that it's not been too long ago that the US is basically saying that everybody should be using end-to-end encryption for their data products because the Chinese have accessed the telecoms backdoors. So the ability for them to be able to access that data is the same access that was backdoor created for the US government. The Chinese are now using to be able to access anyone's data that's not encrypted on the US networks. So they are advising people to use the end-to-end encryption. And now we are a few months, few years later, and we're sitting there again exposing our citizens' data to anybody who gets access to that backdoor.
I completely agree, and that's why I found it encouraging when I read up on the topic that there's been one senator and one congressman who got together and wrote a firmly worded letter to the new head of intelligence in the US, Tulsi Gabbard, well known from fame of being allegedly a Russian agent. I honestly don't know. I have no opinion on it. But who knows? Who knows? The topic is that we don't know. We don't know who can see our data and what they're going to do with it. And You've mentioned China because that was the topic of conversation about 4 or 5 years ago, when the US said, yes, let's encrypt everything.
Or recommended people encrypt everything.
Yes. And okay, so they make out China to be the bad guy, but given the current situation in the US, if you're a woman who has irregular periods, is that any worse than your own government? Really? Or anywhere else? Every country currently seems to have some kind of issues, some kind of problems, and I personally would not trust anyone with my personal data. But anyways, there are new developments in the Apple and UK government conversation. As I mentioned, there are strongly worded letters being written and hopefully looked at.
Yeah, and I think what's important as well, if you think about it, people think, oh, this is just affects the UK, but it doesn't just affect the UK, and there's two reasons for that. Firstly, the UK is part of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing community. In other words, any one of the members of the Five Eyes can access the data that the UK government can access now with this backdoor. So if you sorry, just to take a step back, the original request from the UK government was not just to access the UK citizens' data. They wanted to access everyone globally's data. So to get, so that people couldn't get around the "I'm not in the UK" scenario. They want to be able to access everyone's data. Secondly, they also requested that this was not to be made known. So they wanted access to the data without the users being aware that they had been given access to the data. So there's two aspects to this that we need to consider that makes it more important. One is that initial request was to make it global, so everyone's data, not just people in the UK. The UK government specifying they wanted to be able to access anyone's data, regardless of where they were physically located. And B, they wanted to be able to achieve this without the users being made aware. So this information has been leaked to journalists who've been now published the story. It's not been Apple that's made that information public, but it has been confirmed by UK users that they're not able to do it. So there's the original request was far more severe than what we've ended up with. So that's one thing to consider. The second thing is that the Five Eyes organization means that if anyone within the Five Eyes community wants access to the UK's users' data, they are able to access that data. That's part of the sharing of information. So, criminals that are physically based in the UK will now be exposed to not just the UK government, but also to any of the governments part of the Five Eyes organization. But what's more worrying?
Can I just stop you quickly and briefly? The Five Eyes, you mention it a lot. For those people out there who don't know what it is, can you just briefly summarize it?
It's a treaty amongst, I think, 5 countries. I'm not sure which are the 5 ones. I'd have to look it up. But they basically agreed to share intelligence data amongst themselves. So I know the UK and the US, I think it's Australia, as well as one of the 3, that they are sharing intelligence information amongst themselves. That's part of the agreement. It's basically a treaty to agree to share intelligence information. So if you've got a terrorist that might be flitting between these countries, then these organizations can work together and share the data that's been used to track that individual across the country boundaries. It's a bit like, Interpol from a police perspective, but from an intelligence perspective, including these countries that are part of that agreement. Does that make sense?
It does.
But from my perspective, what's really concerning is the fact that it's been done at all. To say, it's just the UK and just the UK users, it's going to very quickly be other governments to say, well, you've permitted that access to UK users, we also want that access, right? So you can see the US happening in the US very quickly, which is why I suspect that senators are writing letters, what did you say, firmly worded letters to the head of intelligence in the US, Tulsi Gabbard. But you say, well, it's just friendly governments, but what happens when it starts becoming unfriendly governments? What happens if Russia or any other pariah state starts trying to claim they need access not just to their citizens' data, but to anyone's data? And if it's not just Apple products, it's now suddenly all product services. It's that usual point to the example. Apple, this big organization, is giving them access to it. Apple, this big organization, is giving access into the UK. We wanted to be able to do it now, but we don't just want it from Apple. We want it from any technology, any application, any form of data. And we wanted global, the original request of the UK government. We wanted global data. We want to be able to, then nobody has any privacy anymore, especially if it's done without the user's knowledge. And that's why I think, what we talk about here, about keeping your data private, it's absolutely fundamentally important that you're the one that's in control of your key and that you decide, who has access to your data. That, as in the case that Apple has at the moment, they can't decrypt the data that's stored in the iCloud from a user's perspective. The problem with the Apple products, again, is that the software itself is not open source. So if they decide to change the code, right, they decide to change the encryption that's been used to upload your data and store your data in the iCloud, you will not be able to see that they've made that change. You may think that you still have access to your key. You may think that it's still your key that's been used to encrypt the data. But if Apple changes the code, they can make it so that they are the ones that now own a new key, that all the data is now decrypted using your key, and the next step is to encrypt it again using their key, and that they then own the key going forward. And I think that's what the UK government wanted from Apple in the first place, that they basically changed the encryption so that Apple was able to decrypt the data so that they could request that data at any point in time in the future. And that's the worrying thing about using software that you don't control for any purpose, for that matter. You don't know what's happening to the data that you're storing in an application if you cannot see the code that's being used to keep your data, whether it's on your device or not. That's why I think also open source software is so vitally important, because if anyone tries to make a change, it's very quickly picked up by people who care about these things. I know there's an example of a piece of software. It was not a very important piece of software. It's basically a piece of software for creating sound, and basically for sound auditors and engineers, like that. And there was a change to put in tracking to see how the software has been used, so that they could fair enough to say, well, what features do users use, what features do users not use, so that they can decide what to focus their attention on. A legitimate request, but it received such an uproar when the change was put through. First, when the change was initially suggested, there was an uproar, and then it was forced through. It was basically put into the software. And the immediate response was for that software to be forked 3 or 4 times by different people with different views as to how this should be done. Some of them becoming more popular than others. So very quickly we got another version of the software that didn't have the tracking encryption into it. And they were only able to go back to the original software users and the original developers when the organization decided to undo that change and remove the tracking software from it. So it's not just the fact that it happened. It's not just the fact that it wasn't as dangerous as it expected. It's not just that what precedent this sets for itself, but also focusing on the fact that it was nearly done without our knowledge, and that you would have thought that, I've still got this advanced encryption, but the reality was that you didn't. And I think that's the real worry going forward. What do you know what your software is doing, and do you know what your government is requesting of these organizations? Because Apple still hasn't come out with a comment about why they were requesting, why they've done this change without actually making people aware, other than the fact that they were told not to.
Yes, or like in the 2015 case, where the same thing happened when Apple was pressured to take off one of their security features. Somebody made the comment that legal killed it. In other words, the lawyers decided that the advanced security feature was no longer allowed because of I think it was in the US, where the FBI requested something similar of Apple back then. and laws are arbitrary at times. Anyways, 2015 they got
I think
through it. I think this time as well they may get come through.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing with that example was that they were asked to create a bit of software so they could unlock um, a person's phone that they wanted to get access to the data that was on the phone, and Apple refused at the time. And the only reason the pressure was released is they managed to find somebody else who was prepared to create the software and be able to unlock that phone for them.
That was a
So,
different incident, actually. That there have been numerous and many conversations between Apple and governments or government enforcement agencies in terms of how and what the security should look like and what it should offer people.
yes,
I hope that Apple is going to do the right thing and restore it. I hope that the situation is going to change because currently, as you rightly said, nobody who's using an Apple product can say for sure that their software really is still as secure and encrypted as they think. The strongly and firmly worded letter in the US from the Senate and the governor to Ms. Gabbard mentions that Apple does not build software for each country specifically. They have one code base and they roll it out to the different countries and nation states. And that means if it is something is switched off in the UK, sooner or later it will find its way to the US. Exactly what you said before as well. Eventually it'll spread.
yeah. Or what happens, as you said earlier, the reverse. What happens if a US citizen goes to the UK for a holiday?
Yes, you
You know,
know.
and but yeah, it's the challenge, and governments are continually pressuring technical organizations, technology organizations, to create backdoors to their encryption. There was an example fairly recently as well with India trying to request backdoors to the Signal chatter application. That's again, it's an open source encrypted application, end-to-end encryption, where the user controls the encryption. Signal doesn't have the ability to access the data. So they basically turn around to India and says, not only won't we, but we can't. And I think that's incredibly powerful situation to be in, to say, that you are unable to create what they're requesting. Apple clearly are able to create that, but Signal, for example, is unable to. It doesn't stop a country from banning the application from being used, going forward. We saw that recently in the US itself with TikTok as an application that's been banned for use in the US. But yeah, at least the organization and the application creators can hold their heads up high and say, we're not refusing, we're just unable to do what you're asking.
And that I think may be a good template and a good way forward for companies who have products that um, deal with data or people's data, companies' data as well.
Yeah, it also makes it very important where your data, if you're storing data in the cloud, where the data is physically stored, as to what governments can gain access to that data. Can turn up with a search warrant at the data center itself and say, you want to be able to access this data physically.
Let's see what happens. As I said, I think there will be more conversations. I don't think it's going to be the final decision just yet. I think more will develop over the next few weeks, and I, for one, will be following the conversation.
Yeah, should be good.
Now, for full disclosure, I don't actually use Apple products. I have one very, very, very old iPad that's beyond its original lifespan, so that's not going to be covered by this law at all. But just because I personally don't use the technology doesn't mean that the conversation is not of interest to me. Because other companies, as you said, Marcel, other companies have the same issues, the same problems. And just because we know about the Apple conversation in the UK, we don't know which other companies have been spoken to. We don't know. I can assume, I can guess, but ultimately I don't know. And I'm guessing now other people don't know either. Let's see. Fingers crossed it's going to go the right way.
It's an interesting conversation, and it's very important, going forward. And I think what's key is, again, as we've discussed previously on this channel, is we need to start assuming that your data is not encrypted, that your data is not safe, unless you are personally taking control of it. And I think that's what we're trying to focus on here, is making people aware that if you want to be in control of your data, if you want to, who has access to the data, then you have to make sure that you have control of the encryption of that data, and you are in control of the keys that are used, and that you are in control of the applications that you use that have that data accessible. Otherwise, you're going to have to start assuming that your data is available and public to everyone.
Now, is that something that worries you people out there? Or is that something you have experience with? Do write in, put something in the comments, and let us know what your opinion is on the Apple case, on your data being considered open and publicly available to everyone. Would you ever worry if your government would find out what you store in the cloud? Tell us and let's have that conversation. Also, our next event, as always, is the third, no, the fourth, the fourth week of the month. Join us. It's always
Fourth Tuesday.
Yes, the fourth Tuesday of the month, 4 p.m. UTC. So check your time zone. Summertime is about to start as well in the northern hemisphere, and wintertime in the southern hemisphere. So make sure you get the right time zone. And we'd love to have you on the call as well. Or alternatively, just post a comment and tell us your opinions on data security. Do you have anything else for today?
No, looking forward to the feedback that we're getting.
Yes, same here. And with that, I hope you have a good weekend, a good week, and a good weekend ahead. And see you next month. Bye bye.
Bye.